Hello, this is the World of the 20th Century podcast, and I'm your professor, Adam Polk. History. Lesson 10. Chapter 19. Latin America, Democracy, Free Markets, and Regional Stability. Chapter 19 examines developments in the Americas during the 1980s and 1990s, particularly the movement towards greater economic integration, as evidenced in the North American Free Trade Agreement, as well as growth of democracy in Latin America and a decline in overt American imperialism in the region. The North American Free Trade Agreement came out of a desire for greater economic integration among America and Canada at a time when their trade relationship was at such a high level, and also a time in which competing world regions, such as Europe and East Asia, were moving towards closer integration of their economies. Under Canadian Conservative Prime Minister Brian Mulroney and American Republican President Ronald Reagan, the two countries signed a treaty in 1987 that sought an end to tariffs and other trade barriers between the two countries. Mexico was added to the free trade zone, and NAFTA came into force with Mexico, the United States, and Canada in 1994. The text notes that there was not universal support within each of these nations for the agreement. With the creation of this zone, many other countries in the region clamored for entry into this exclusive and potentially profitable club. Indeed, the creation of NAFTA set in motion a movement for a reform of trading agreements in Latin America, as nations excluded from NAFTA sought their own sub-regional agreements with an eye to better trading among Latin American states, and also likely as a strategic move to end the kind of protectionism that would certainly keep the states from being invited to join, in some way, NAFTA or some larger free trade zone. The reform of many of these Latin American economies created great hardships at home, as previously subsidized and protected domestic economies were now exposed to wider global market forces, and many home industries and economy sectors in Latin American countries were thus driven out of business because they could not compete with the influx of more cheaply made foreign goods. This occurrence inevitably created unemployment and dissatisfaction at home. As one of the important themes in Latin America in the 1980s was greater economic liberalism and move to freer trade, another was the general trend towards greater democratization. Latin American states did not have a long record of stable democratic institutions, and authoritarian rule was more often the rule than the exception. As the text notes, three exceptions to a more democratic region were the three states of Cuba, Haiti, and Peru. One very positive trend was the end of two violent Central American civil wars in Nicaragua and El Salvador. An important factor in this regard was the collapse of European communism, specifically the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. This was a significant factor because it allowed the United States to generally cease propping up authoritarian regimes or funding rebel movements in the Americas as a strategy to prevent the spread of communism in the region. In the case of Nicaragua, the U.S. stopped supporting the rebel Contras as Moscow ceased its support of the Sandinista government. The Sandinistas had overthrown an American-supported Somoza dictatorship in 1979. And during the 1980s, the CIA funded the anti-Sandinista government, which was being supported by Cuba and the Soviet Union. As the end of the 20th century came to be, a real and symbolic example of the lessening of American imperialism in the Americas was the return of the Panama Canal Zone to Panama, thus allowing the state of Panama to reassert full sovereignty over its own territory. The Americans took control of the Panama Canal Zone, a vital economic transport system, in 1903 in reward for helping Panama assert and gain its independence from Colombia, of which it had been a province.